The morning mist hung heavy over Whitmore Secondary School as the Black Range Rover pulled through the front gates. Inside the vehicle, Prince Alexander of Westmarch adjusted his navy blazer and checked his watch. Another school visit, another carefully orchestrated public appearance designed to show the royal family's commitment to education. At 35, the prince had attended hundreds of these events, each one blending into the next like pages in an endless book of obligation. The school's headmaster, Mr. Geoffrey Thornton, stood waiting at the entrance with a nervous smile plastered across his face. Behind him, a line of teachers fidgeted with their ties and smoothed their skirts. The prince had learned long ago to read the subtle signs of anxiety that preceded his arrival anywhere. The slightly too bright smiles, the way people stood just a bit too straight, the careful positioning of everything to appear perfect. As the car door opened, Prince Alexander stepped onto the pavement with practiced grace. The autumn air carried the familiar scent of chalk dust and floor polish that seemed to permeate every educational institution he had ever visited. A small group of reporters and photographers had gathered behind a rope barrier, their cameras already clicking away as he emerged. "Your Royal Highness, welcome to Whitmore Secondary," Mr. Thornton said, extending his hand with barely concealed excitement. "We are truly honored by your visit today." The prince shook hands with the headmaster, noting the man's slightly damp palm. "Thank you for having me, Mr. Thornton. I understand you have some impressive programs here that I should see." "Indeed, sir. We've prepared a comprehensive tour of our facilities. Our students have been working extremely hard to prepare presentations for you." Mr. Thornton gestured toward the building's entrance, where curious faces pressed against windows, trying to catch a glimpse of royalty. As they walked through the corridors, the prince observed the typical signs of a school that had been thoroughly prepared for his arrival. Fresh paint gleamed on the walls, bulletin boards displayed perfectly arranged student work, and not a single piece of litter could be found anywhere. He had seen this transformation countless times before, the way institutions would present their absolute best version of themselves when royalty came calling. The first stop was the science laboratory, where a group of 15-year-old students had prepared a chemistry demonstration. The prince watched politely as they mixed solutions and explained their experiment, asking the appropriate questions about their studies and future aspirations. The students beamed with pride as they answered, clearly thrilled to be speaking directly with a member of the royal family. Next came the art studio, where young artists had displayed their latest creations. Prince Alexander moved slowly along the displays, offering encouraging words about composition and color choice. The art teacher, Miss Caroline Webb, practically glowed as she explained each piece and the techniques the students had employed. The mathematics classroom followed, where students demonstrated advanced problem-solving techniques on smartboards. The prince found himself genuinely impressed by their computational skills, though he made sure not to show favoritism by lingering too long in any one area. It was in the English classroom that the day's events would take an unexpected turn. Mrs. Helen Morrison, the head of the English department, had arranged for her Year 11 students to present creative writing samples. The classroom had been arranged with desks in perfect rows, each one displaying a handwritten essay or poem for the prince's review. "Your Royal Highness," Mrs. Morrison began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had taught for over 20 years. "Our students have prepared some of their finest creative writing pieces. We believe strongly in the importance of handwritten work, as it helps develop both creativity and penmanship." Prince Alexander nodded approvingly. "An admirable approach, Mrs. Morrison. There's something to be said for the traditional methods." The students stood behind their desks as the prince began his circuit around the room. Each desk bore a nameplate and a carefully arranged piece of writing. The first few students had produced work in neat, flowing script, the kind of handwriting that teachers and parents praised and held up as examples to others. "Excellent work, James," the prince said to a tall boy with perfectly combed hair whose essay about environmental conservation was written in precise, uniform letters. "Thank you, sir," James replied with a slight bow, his face flushing with pride. The prince continued his rounds, offering similar praise to Sarah, whose poem about autumn was penned in elegant cursive, and to Michael, whose short story about space exploration was laid out with mathematical precision on the page. As he moved through the classroom, Prince Alexander began to notice the careful choreography of the visit. Every student whose work he examined had produced writing that looked as if it could have come from a calligraphy textbook. The papers were crisp, the ink uniform, and the spacing perfect. It was the kind of presentation that spoke to hours of preparation and multiple drafts. The prince was beginning to think this would be another routine educational visit when he reached the desk in the back corner of the room. Here sat Emma Chun, a 16-year-old girl with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and intelligent brown eyes that watched his approach with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. Emma's essay, titled "The Importance of Authentic Expression," was handwritten like all the others, but her penmanship told a very different story. Her handwriting was functional rather than beautiful, with letters that varied in size and slant. Some words were squeezed together where she had misjudged spacing, while others stretched across wide gaps. The occasional cross-out marked where she had corrected a word or changed her mind about a phrase. Most notably, Emma's handwriting showed the signs of someone who thought faster than she could write. Letters would start with careful precision, but gradually become more hurried as her ideas flowed onto the page. It was the handwriting of someone more concerned with capturing thoughts than creating visual perfection. Prince Alexander paused at Emma's desk, his eyes scanning the opening paragraph of her essay. Despite the imperfect presentation, the content immediately caught his attention. Emma had written about the pressure students face to conform to arbitrary standards of perfection, arguing that authentic expression often gets lost in the pursuit of surface-level achievement. "Interesting topic, Miss Chun," the prince said, though his tone was noticeably cooler than it had been with previous students. His eyes remained fixed on the uneven lines of text. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," Emma replied quietly, sensing the subtle shift in his demeanor but unsure of its cause. The prince continued reading, but his expression began to change. What had started as polite interest was gradually replaced by something that looked distinctly like disapproval. His eyes moved across Emma's handwriting with increasing scrutiny, taking in every imperfect letter and uneven line. Mrs. Morrison, who had been following the prince's progress around the room, noticed his prolonged pause at Emma's desk. She approached quietly, ready to redirect his attention to another student's work if necessary. "Is there a problem, Your Royal Highness?" she asked in a low voice, though her words carried clearly in the suddenly quiet classroom. Prince Alexander looked up from the essay, his gaze moving from the paper to Emma's face and back again. The silence stretched uncomfortably as 28 students and their teacher waited for his response. "Miss Chun," the prince said finally, his voice carrying a note of criticism that sent a chill through the room. "Do you take pride in your work?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Emma blinked, clearly caught off guard by both the question and its tone. "Yes, sir, I do," she answered, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "Then, perhaps you could explain to me why your handwriting appears so—" The prince paused, as if searching for the right word, though it seemed clear he had already chosen it. "Careless." The word fell into the classroom like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled students. Several of them exchanged quick glances, while others stared down at their own carefully prepared papers. Emma's face flushed red, but whether from embarrassment or indignation was unclear. "I'm sorry, Your Royal Highness. I tried my best with both the content and the presentation." "Did you?" the prince asked, holding up the essay so that the uneven handwriting was visible to more of the room. "Because this looks to me like the work of someone who couldn't be bothered to take proper care with their penmanship." Mrs. Morrison stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "Your Royal Highness, Emma is one of our most thoughtful writers. Her ideas are always—" "Mrs. Morrison," the prince interrupted, his attention still focused on Emma, "surely you would agree that presentation matters." that how we present ourselves and our work is a reflection of our character and respect for others. The teacher found herself in an impossible position. Disagreeing with the prince would be inappropriate, but she also felt compelled to defend her student. Of course, sir, though I believe there are many ways to show respect and effort. Prince Alexander's expression suggested he disagreed. He set Emma's essay back down on her desk, but his eyes remained fixed on the imperfect handwriting. In my experience, Miss Chun, those who cannot take the time to write properly rarely take the time to think properly either. Sloppy presentation usually indicates sloppy thinking. The harshness of the criticism sent a visible shock through the classroom. Emma's face had gone from red to pale, and her hands trembled slightly as they rested on her desk. Several of her classmates looked genuinely distressed on her behalf. "I spent weeks working on this essay, sir," Emma said, finding her voice despite the obvious upset. "I researched the topic thoroughly and revised it multiple times. I know my handwriting isn't perfect, but I focused on making my arguments clear and well-supported." The prince's response was swift and cutting. "Miss Chun, clear arguments are meaningless if they're presented in a manner that shows disrespect for the reader. Your handwriting suggests a careless attitude that undermines whatever merit your ideas might have." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma sat frozen at her desk, while her classmates struggled to process what they were witnessing. Mrs. Morrison appeared torn between professional protocol and maternal instinct to protect her student. It was at this moment that something unexpected happened. Instead of apologizing or looking away in shame, Emma lifted her chin and met the prince's gaze directly. "With respect, Your Royal Highness," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I believe that judging someone's character or intelligence based solely on their handwriting is unfair and short-sighted." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. No one could quite believe that a 16-year-old student had just contradicted a member of the royal family. Mrs. Morrison's face went white, while Mr. Thornton, who had just entered the room to check on the visit's progress, froze in the doorway. Prince Alexander's eyebrows rose in surprise. He was clearly unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by a teenager, and especially in public. The dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically from a routine royal visit to something much more volatile and unpredictable. "I beg your pardon?" the prince said, his voice dangerously quiet. Emma took a deep breath, knowing she had already crossed a line, but feeling compelled to continue. "I said that judging people based on their handwriting seems unfair. Some people have learning differences that affect their writing, others focus more on content than appearance, and some are simply better at expressing themselves verbally than in written form. My handwriting may not be beautiful, but my ideas are valid and my effort is real." The tension in the room was now palpable. Teachers and students alike recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a direct confrontation between a royal visitor and a student that had moved far beyond the scripted boundaries of a typical school visit. Prince Alexander stood completely still for a long moment, his eyes locked on Emma's face. The girl had shown remarkable courage in speaking up, but she had also committed what many would consider a serious breach of protocol. The prince's next words would determine whether this incident would be quietly forgotten or become something much larger. "Miss Chun," he said finally, his voice carrying a warning that everyone in the room could hear clearly, "I think you forget yourself." But Emma, perhaps driven by adrenaline or principle, did not back down. "No, sir. I think I'm finally standing up for myself. And for everyone else who has ever been judged by something as superficial as handwriting instead of the substance of their character or the quality of their thoughts." The gauntlet had been thrown down completely now. What had started as a routine school visit had become something unprecedented, a public challenge to royal authority by a teenager who refused to be intimidated. The consequences of this moment would extend far beyond the walls of this single classroom. But for now, everyone present was frozen in time, waiting to see how Prince Alexander would respond to the most direct challenge to his authority he had faced in years. The silence that followed Emma's bold statement seemed to stretch for an eternity, though in reality, it lasted only seconds. Prince Alexander's face had transformed from mild disapproval to something much harder and more calculating. His years of royal training had taught him to maintain composure in any situation, but this 16-year-old girl had just publicly challenged not only his opinion, but his authority itself. Mrs. Morrison finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a strangled whisper. "Emma, please no," the prince said sharply, raising his hand to silence the teacher. His eyes never left Emma's face. "Let Miss Chun continue. I'm quite interested to hear more about her thoughts on respect and proper conduct." Emma felt her heart hammering in her chest, but something inside her refused to back down. She had spent her entire life watching people defer to authority figures, even when those figures were wrong. She had seen teachers ignore bullying because the bullies came from important families, watched classmates bite their tongues when visiting dignitaries made ignorant comments, and observe how power so often went unchallenged simply because people were afraid to speak up. "Your Royal Highness," Emma began, her voice gaining strength despite the trembling in her hands, "I understand that you're accustomed to people agreeing with everything you say, but that doesn't make everything you say correct." An audible gasp came from somewhere in the room. Several students looked genuinely terrified for Emma, while others watched with a mixture of admiration and horror. This was the kind of moment that would be talked about for years, assuming Emma survived it professionally and socially intact. Prince Alexander took a step closer to Emma's desk, his presence suddenly feeling much more imposing. "Miss Chun, do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" "Yes, sir. You're Prince Alexander of Westmarch. But, with respect, your title doesn't make you an expert on handwriting, learning differences, or the best ways to judge someone's character or effort." The boldness of her response sent another shock wave through the room. Mr. Thornton, who had been frozen in the doorway, now looked as though he might faint. His school's reputation, funding, and future royal visits all hung in the balance of this increasingly volatile exchange. "Emma," he said, finally finding his voice, "perhaps you should—" "Mr. Thornton," the prince said without turning around, "I'd like to hear what Miss Chun has to say. She seems to have strong opinions about proper conduct and respect. I'm curious to learn more." There was something dangerous in the prince's tone now, an edge that suggested Emma was walking into a trap. But she had come too far to retreat now, and something deep inside her rebelled against the idea of backing down from what she believed was right. "I'm not trying to be disrespectful," Emma said, though she knew that ship had probably already sailed. "I'm just saying that judging people by their handwriting is unfair. Some of the most brilliant minds in history had terrible handwriting. Einstein, for example, or many doctors whose prescriptions are famously illegible. Does their poor penmanship make their contributions to science and medicine less valuable?" Prince Alexander's smile was cold and humorless. "Are you comparing yourself to Einstein, Miss Chun?" "No, sir. I'm pointing out that handwriting and intelligence aren't connected the way you suggested. Some people have dysgraphia, which makes writing difficult despite normal intelligence. Others think faster than they can write. And some people simply prioritize content over presentation because they believe ideas matter more than appearance." "Ideas matter more than appearance," the prince repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "How interesting. Tell me, Miss Chun, do you think I should abandon my formal attire for these school visits? Perhaps wear jeans and a t-shirt? After all, if appearance doesn't matter, why should I bother with proper dress?" Emma recognized the trap he was setting, but she also saw the flaw in his logic. "That's different, sir. Your clothing choice is about showing respect for the occasion and the people you're meeting. But my handwriting doesn't disrespect anyone. It's simply the way I naturally write when I'm focused on communicating ideas clearly." "Ah, but you see, Miss Chun, that's where you're wrong. Your careless handwriting shows disrespect to everyone who has to read it. It suggests that you couldn't be bothered to present your work in a manner that's pleasant and easy to read. It places the burden on your reader to decipher your scrawl rather than taking the time to write legibly. Emma felt a flash of anger at his characterization of her writing as scrawl, but she forced herself to respond calmly. My handwriting may not be beautiful, but it's perfectly readable, and I spent hours crafting the content of that essay. I revised it multiple times, checked my facts, and made sure my arguments were logical and well-supported. I put enormous effort into the substance of my work, but you couldn't be bothered to put equal effort into making it presentable, the prince shot back, which suggests that you don't truly respect your readers or your work. If you cared about your essay, you would have taken the time to copy it over in neat handwriting. Or, Emma countered, it suggests that I understand the difference between substance and superficial appearance. I'd rather spend my time improving my arguments than making my letters perfectly uniform. The exchange was becoming more heated with each volley, and the observers in the room could feel the tension building to a dangerous level. Mrs. Morrison kept glancing nervously between her student and the prince, clearly torn between pride in Emma's courage and terror at the potential consequences. Prince Alexander's facade of polite interest was beginning to crack, revealing the genuine irritation beneath. Miss Chun, your attitude perfectly exemplifies the decline in standards that I see throughout modern education. Young people who think they can cut corners and justify it with philosophical arguments about substance over style. The truth is, both matter. A truly educated person understands the importance of presenting their work properly. And a truly fair person, Emma replied, her own composure beginning to slip, understands that not everyone has the same abilities or the same circumstances. Not everyone has the luxury of spending hours perfecting their handwriting. Some of us have to work jobs after school, or help care for family members, or deal with learning differences that make writing physically difficult. Your assumption that poor handwriting equals laziness or disrespect shows how out of touch you are with the real world. The accusation of being out of touch hit Prince Alexander like a physical blow. It was a criticism he had heard before, usually from political opponents or tabloid journalists, and it touched on one of his deepest insecurities about his role and relevance in modern society. Out of touch, he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. Miss Chun, I have visited hundreds of schools, hospitals, and community centers. I have met with students, teachers, and families from every background imaginable. I am intimately familiar with the challenges facing young people today. Then, why don't you understand that handwriting isn't one of them? Emma shot back. Why are you more concerned with how my letters look than with what I have to say? I wrote about authentic expression and the pressure to conform to arbitrary standards. And your response is to criticize my handwriting instead of engaging with my ideas. You're proving my point better than I ever could have myself. The truth of her observation hung in the air like an accusation. Prince Alexander realized, with uncomfortable clarity, that he had indeed focused entirely on the superficial aspects of her work while ignoring its content. The essay he had dismissed was actually about the very kind of judgment he was demonstrating. But rather than acknowledging this insight, the prince felt his pride and authority being challenged in a way he simply could not accept. Miss Chun, your presumption in lecturing me about understanding and fairness is remarkable. You speak as though you have some special insight into the struggles of your generation that I lack. Maybe I do, Emma said quietly, but her words carried clearly through the silent room. With respect, sir, when was the last time you worried about whether you could afford university? When did you last have to choose between buying school supplies and helping pay for groceries? When did you ever face discrimination or judgment based on something you couldn't control? The questions hit home with devastating accuracy. Prince Alexander had never faced any of the challenges Emma described, and they both knew it. His entire life had been one of privilege, comfort, and deference from others. My circumstances are irrelevant, he said stiffly. We are discussing your handwriting and your attitude. No, sir, we're discussing your assumption that poor handwriting reflects poor character. And I'm suggesting that maybe someone who has never faced real hardship might not be the best judge of other people's efforts and challenges. The room was now electric with tension. Emma had moved from questioning the prince's opinion to directly challenging his qualifications to make such judgments. It was an unprecedented breach of protocol, but it was also an uncommonly clear articulation of the disconnect between royal privilege and ordinary experience. Prince Alexander felt cornered in a way he had never experienced before. This teenager had not only challenged his authority, but had done so with logic and passion that was difficult to dismiss. Worse, she had identified uncomfortable truths about his position and perspective that he was not prepared to confront. "Miss Chun," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger, "your disrespect is astounding. I came here to encourage and support young people in their education. Instead, I find myself being lectured by a child who apparently believes that standards and expectations are merely optional suggestions. I believe that unfair standards should be questioned," Emma replied, her own anger now clearly visible. "And I believe that someone who judges a student's character based on their handwriting rather than their ideas has no business visiting schools to encourage and support anyone." The gasp that went through the room at this statement was audible. Emma had just told a member of the royal family that he had no business visiting schools. It was the kind of statement that could have serious consequences not just for her, but potentially for the entire school. Mrs. Morrison finally stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "Your Royal Highness, perhaps we should—" "No," the prince said sharply, his eyes still locked on Emma's face. "I want to hear what else Miss Chen has to say. She seems to have strong opinions about my qualifications and my purpose here." Emma knew she had already gone much further than was wise, but something inside her refused to back down. She thought about all the times she had watched people in authority make unfair judgments and go unchallenged. She thought about her classmates who struggled with various learning differences, but were often dismissed as lazy or careless. She thought about the essay she had written, sitting there ignored while this man focused on the spacing between her letters. "I think your visit here proves my point perfectly," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was saying. "You came here supposedly to see what students are learning and creating, but when faced with work that doesn't meet your superficial standards of presentation, you immediately dismiss it and judge the person who created it. You don't care about authentic expression or individual challenges. You only care about conformity and appearance. And you," Prince Alexander replied, his composure finally beginning to crack, "care nothing for respect, tradition, or proper conduct. You represent everything that's wrong with modern education. The belief that effort is optional, that standards are negotiable, and that authority can be dismissed whenever it becomes inconvenient. I represent someone who refuses to be judged unfairly," Emma said firmly, "and someone who believes that true authority comes from wisdom and fairness, not from accidents of birth." The final sentence fell into the room like a bomb. Emma had just directly challenged not only Prince Alexander's judgment, but the entire foundation of royal authority itself. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of someone's sharp intake of breath. Prince Alexander stared at Emma for a long moment, his face cycling through anger, disbelief, and something that might have been grudging respect. This 16-year-old girl had just given him the most direct challenge to his worldview and authority that he had experienced in his entire life. "Miss Chun," he said finally, his voice deadly quiet, "I think this conversation has gone quite far enough." But Emma, having come this far, seemed determined to finish what she had started. "Has it, sir? Because I think we've just gotten to the heart of the matter. You want respect and deference based on your title. I believe respect should be earned through actions and character. And judging someone's worth by their handwriting doesn't earn my respect, regardless of what title you hold." The challenge was now complete and unmistakable. In front of a room full of witnesses, a teenager had told a prince that his title meant nothing without the character to back it up. The consequences of this moment would ripple far beyond the walls of Whitmore Secondary School. But for now, everyone present could only wait to see how this unprecedented confrontation would end. The aftermath of Emma's final statement hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Prince Alexander stood completely still, his face a mask that betrayed nothing of the storm raging behind his eyes. For 35 years, he had lived in a world where his opinions went unchallenged, his judgments were accepted without question, and his very presence commanded automatic deference. Now, a 16-year-old girl had just told him that his title meant nothing without the character to support it. Mr. Thornton, who had been watching the exchange with growing horror, finally found the courage to speak. "Your Royal Highness, please accept my sincere apologies for this student's behavior. I can assure you that, Mr. Thornton," the prince said without taking his eyes off Emma, "there's no need for you to apologize for Miss Chen's words. She seems quite capable of speaking for herself." The headmaster's relief was visible, though short-lived. The prince's tone suggested that while he might not blame the school's administration for Emma's behavior, the matter was far from resolved. "However," Prince Alexander continued, "I think it would be appropriate for Miss Chen to explain to the room exactly what she means by her statements. After all, she has made some rather serious accusations about my character and qualifications." Emma felt every eye in the room focused on her. Her classmates' expressions ranged from admiration to terror, while her teachers looked like they were witnessing a disaster in slow motion. She knew that backing down now might salvage the situation for everyone involved, but something deep inside her rebelled against the idea of apologizing for speaking the truth as she saw it. "I meant exactly what I said, Your Royal Highness," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I believe that judging someone's worth or effort based on their handwriting is unfair and superficial. I believe that true authority comes from wisdom, fairness, and understanding, not from inherited titles. And I believe that visiting schools to encourage students while simultaneously dismissing their work over trivial presentation issues is counterproductive." The prince took a step closer to Emma's desk, his presence even more imposing at close range. "And do you believe, Miss Chun, that your behavior today demonstrates the kind of wisdom and understanding you claim to value?" It was a clever counterattack, and Emma recognized it as such. The prince was trying to turn her own arguments against her, suggesting that her disrespectful behavior undermined her claims about character and wisdom. "I believe," Emma said carefully, "that standing up for fairness and speaking truth to power, even when it's uncomfortable, takes more courage and character than staying silent in the face of injustice." "Injustice?" The prince's eyebrows rose. "You consider my observation about your handwriting to be injustice. I consider your assumption that my handwriting reflects my character or effort to be unfair. Yes. And I consider the broader pattern of judging people by superficial standards rather than substance to be a real problem in our society." Mrs. Morrison, who had been silent during this exchange, finally found her voice again. "Emma, perhaps you could—" "No, Mrs. Morrison," the prince interrupted. "I want to hear more about Miss Chen's theories on society and judgment. She seems to have appointed herself as an expert on these matters." The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable, but Emma refused to be intimidated. "I'm not an expert, sir. I'm just someone who's been judged unfairly often enough to recognize it when I see it happening to others." "Judged unfairly?" The prince seized on this admission. "How so?" Emma hesitated for a moment, realizing that answering this question would mean revealing personal information that she had never shared with her classmates. But she had come too far to stop now. "I have dysgraphia, Your Royal Highness. It's a learning difference that affects handwriting and fine motor control. I've spent my entire school career being told that my handwriting is messy, careless, or disrespectful, when the truth is that it's simply the best I can do with the neurological wiring I was born with." The revelation sent a ripple of understanding through the room. Several of Emma's classmates looked at her with new comprehension, while Mrs. Morrison's expression showed a mixture of pride in her students' courage and concern for what she had just revealed. Prince Alexander's expression faltered slightly. He had not expected this personal disclosure, and it complicated his position considerably. Criticizing someone's handwriting was one thing. Criticizing a student with a diagnosed learning difference was quite another. "I was not aware of your condition," he said, and for the first time, his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "No, sir, you weren't," Emma agreed. "Because you didn't ask. You didn't try to understand why my handwriting looks the way it does. You just made an assumption and a judgment based on appearance. That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes school difficult for students with learning differences, students from different cultural backgrounds, students who are dealing with challenges at home, or anyone else who doesn't fit the standard mold." The prince was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with this new information. Emma's revelation had shifted the dynamic of their confrontation in a fundamental way. What had seemed like a simple matter of a disrespectful student was now a much more complex situation involving disability rights and fair treatment. "Even so," the prince said finally, "your manner of addressing me has been inappropriate. There are proper ways to raise concerns about unfair treatment." "Are there?" Emma challenged. "Because in my experience, those proper ways usually involve going through channels that protect the people in power while silencing the people who are being treated unfairly. When was the last time a student's complaint about unfair treatment by a royal visitor was taken seriously through proper channels?" The question hung in the air unanswered, because everyone in the room knew the truth of it. Students, especially students with learning differences or other challenges, rarely had any real recourse when treated unfairly by authority figures. Furthermore, Emma continued, "You keep talking about respect and proper conduct. But what about your conduct? You publicly humiliated me in front of my classmates and teachers. You made assumptions about my character and effort without bothering to learn the facts. You dismissed my work without even reading it. Is that the kind of behavior that earns respect?" Prince Alexander felt the ground shifting beneath him in a way he had never experienced. The girl's arguments were not only passionate, but logical, and her revelation about her learning difference had transformed her from a disrespectful troublemaker into someone fighting against genuine unfairness. "I may have spoken hastily," he admitted, though the words seemed to cost him considerable effort. "You spoke carelessly," Emma corrected. "Just like my handwriting that you criticized. The difference is that my careless handwriting doesn't hurt anyone, while your careless words hurt me and reinforce harmful stereotypes about students with learning differences." The comparison was devastatingly effective. Emma had just used the prince's own criticism against him, pointing out that his careless words were far more harmful than her careless penmanship. Mrs. Morrison, sensing that this might be a crucial moment, stepped forward. "Your Royal Highness, Emma's essay is actually quite excellent. Perhaps you'd like to read the content rather than focusing on the presentation." Prince Alexander looked down at the essay on Emma's desk, seeing it with new eyes. For the first time, he actually began to read the words rather than judging the handwriting that contained them. Emma had written about the pressure students face to conform to arbitrary standards, the importance of authentic expression, and the way society often values appearance over substance. Her arguments were well-reasoned, her examples compelling, and her writing demonstrated both intellectual maturity and genuine passion for her subject. As he read, the prince began to understand the bitter irony of the situation. Emma's essay was about exactly the kind of superficial judgment he had just demonstrated. She had argued against valuing appearance over substance, and he had responded by criticizing her appearance while ignoring her substance. "This is actually quite good," he said quietly, his voice lacking the confidence and authority it had carried throughout the confrontation. "Thank you," Emma replied, though there was no warmth in her acknowledgement. "I worked hard on it." The prince finished reading and looked up at Emma with an expression that was difficult to read. "Miss Chun, I owe you an apology." The words sent a shock through the room even greater than Emma's initial challenge had created. A member of the royal family was apologizing to a student. It was unprecedented, unexpected, and deeply significant. I judged your work unfairly, the prince continued. I made assumptions about your effort and character based on superficial observations, without taking the time to understand either your circumstances or the actual content of your work. That was wrong of me. Emma stared at him, clearly not having expected this turn of events. Thank you, sir. That means a lot. But the prince wasn't finished. However, I also believe that your manner of addressing me, while perhaps understandable given your frustration, was inappropriate. There should be ways to address unfair treatment without resorting to public confrontation. Should be, Emma agreed, but often aren't. Sometimes public confrontation is the only thing that gets people in power to pay attention to unfairness. The prince considered this for a moment. Perhaps that's something we need to work on, creating better channels for students to voice legitimate concerns. Perhaps, Emma said, though her tone suggested she remained skeptical about whether such changes would actually occur. The tension in the room had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a hostile confrontation was evolving into something more complex, a conversation about fairness, authority, and the challenges facing both students and institutions. Miss Chun, the prince said, would you be willing to continue this discussion privately? I find myself interested in your perspectives on education and fairness. Emma looked around the room at her classmates and teachers, all of whom were watching this unprecedented exchange with fascination. Would that discussion involve you actually listening to what I have to say, or just finding more polite ways to dismiss it? The directness of her question brought a slight smile to the prince's face, the first genuine expression he had shown since entering the classroom. I suppose you'll have to trust me to find out. Trust has to be earned, Emma replied, using his own earlier words about respect against him. But I'm willing to give you the chance to earn it. As the two adversaries looked at each other across the classroom, everyone present realized they were witnessing something historic. A royal visit that was supposed to be a routine photo opportunity had become a genuine confrontation about fairness, authority, and the courage to speak truth to power. And somehow, against all odds, it had evolved into the beginning of a dialogue that might actually lead to positive change. But the full consequences of this extraordinary day were yet to be revealed. The private meeting that Prince Alexander had requested took place in Mr. Thornton's office an hour later. The headmaster had reluctantly vacated his own space, leaving the prince and Emma alone with a pot of tea that neither of them had touched, and a tension that was somehow both less hostile and more meaningful than their public confrontation. Emma sat across from the prince, no longer the defiant teenager who had challenged royal authority in front of her classmates, but also not the deferential student that protocol typically demanded. She was simply herself, intelligent, thoughtful, and still somewhat wary of the man who had so publicly criticized her work. Miss Chun, Prince Alexander began, his tone far more conversational than it had been in the classroom. I've been thinking about what you said, about trust being earned. Emma nodded, but remained silent, waiting to see where he would take the conversation. I realized that I came into your classroom today with certain expectations about how the visit would proceed, he continued. Students would show me their work, I would offer encouragement, and everyone would feel satisfied that the royal family cares about education. It was supposed to be predictable, scripted, Emma said quietly. Yes, scripted. And when your work didn't fit the script I had in mind, I responded poorly. I focused on the superficial aspects that bother me instead of trying to understand what you were actually trying to communicate. Emma studied his face, looking for signs that this was simply a more sophisticated form of royal diplomacy. What changed your mind? Prince Alexander leaned back in his chair, considering the question. Honestly, you did. Not just what you said about my behavior, though that was illuminating, but the fact that you were willing to say it at all. Even though I was disrespectful? Were you? The prince asked the question as if he were genuinely uncertain. Or were you honest about unfairness in a way that people rarely are with me? Emma remained quiet, unsure how to respond to this unexpected introspection from someone she had viewed as arrogant and out of touch just hours earlier. I've been thinking about your essay, the prince continued, about authentic expression and the pressure to conform. I realize now that I've spent most of my life surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear. It's rare for anyone to challenge my assumptions or point out when I'm wrong. That must be lonely, Emma said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. Prince Alexander looked at her with genuine surprise. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yes, I suppose it is. When everyone agrees with you all the time, you start to doubt whether you're hearing the truth or just polite deference. Is that why you wanted to talk privately? To hear more truth? Partly, he admitted, but also because I realized that our public confrontation, while perhaps necessary, didn't actually solve anything. I criticized your work unfairly, you called me out on it, I apologized, and now what? Do we just go back to our respective lives and pretend this never happened? Emma considered this. What's the alternative? I'm not sure yet, but I keep thinking about what you said, that sometimes public confrontation is the only way to get people in power to pay attention to unfairness. If that's true, it suggests that there's something fundamentally wrong with the systems we have in place. There is, Emma said simply. Students with learning differences like mine face unfair judgment all the time. So do students from different cultural backgrounds, students dealing with poverty or family problems, and anyone else who doesn't fit the narrow definition of what a good student looks like. And most of the time, there's no recourse. We're just told to work harder, try better, or accept that the standards are the standards. Prince Alexander absorbed this information, his expression thoughtful. What would better recourse look like? Honestly, I don't know if it's possible within the current system. It would require people in authority positions to be willing to admit when they're wrong, to listen to criticism from people with less power, and to change policies and attitudes based on that feedback. In my experience, most authority figures aren't willing to do that. Including me? Emma met his gaze directly. That remains to be seen, doesn't it? The prince was quiet for a long moment, processing not just her words, but the way she continued to speak to him as an equal rather than a superior. What if I told you that I want to do better? That today's events have made me realize I need to fundamentally reconsider how I approach these visits and what I think I'm accomplishing with them. I'd say that's a good start, Emma replied carefully. But wanting to do better and actually doing better are different things. Fair enough. What would actually doing better look like to you? Emma leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued by the question. Well, for starters, it would mean approaching school visits with genuine curiosity instead of predetermined expectations. Instead of looking for work that fits a certain mold, you could ask students about their processes, their challenges, and what they've learned. You could listen to what teachers and students actually need instead of just offering generic encouragement. What else? You could use your platform to advocate for students who face unfair treatment. When you visit schools and see problems, real problems, not cosmetic ones like handwriting, you could speak up about them. You could push for changes in policy that would help students with learning differences, students from disadvantaged backgrounds, and students who are struggling for reasons beyond their control. Prince Alexander nodded slowly. That would be a significant departure from the traditional royal role. Maybe that's what the traditional royal role needs, Emma said boldly. A significant departure. The silence that followed was comfortable rather than tense. Both of them seemed to be processing the implications of their conversation and where it might lead. Miss Chun, the prince said finally, would you be interested in helping me develop a new approach to school visits? Your perspectives on what students actually need would be invaluable. Emma's eyes widened. Are you serious? Completely. I'm thinking about forming an advisory group of students, teachers, and education experts to help redesign these visits to be more meaningful and productive. Your insights today have convinced me that the current approach is not only ineffective, but potentially harmful. And you want my input on this? I'd want you to help lead it, Prince Alexander said. Your willingness to speak truth to power, even when it's uncomfortable, is exactly what this kind of initiative would need. Emma stared at him, clearly struggling to process this unexpected turn of events. A few hours ago, you were telling me that my handwriting reflected poorly on my character. Now you want me to help you redesign royal educational visits. A few hours ago, I was wrong, the prince said simply. About your handwriting, about your character, and about what these visits should accomplish. You helped me see that. Now I'm asking you to help me do something constructive with that insight. What about the protocol issues? The fact that I was disrespectful? Won't there be consequences for how I spoke to you today? Prince Alexander smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Emma had seen from him. Miss Chun, the only consequence of how you spoke to me today is that you've convinced me I need to listen better. If anyone questions your conduct, they'll have to answer to me. Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying. The fear of punishment, academic consequences, or social ostracism that had been lurking in the back of her mind since their confrontation began to dissipate. There's one condition, though, the prince added. Emma's wariness returned. What's that? I want you to promise me that you'll continue to be exactly as honest and direct as you were today. If we're going to make real changes, I need advisors who will tell me when I'm wrong, not just when I'm right. That might not always be comfortable for you, Emma warned. I'm beginning to think that comfort might be overrated, Prince Alexander replied. Besides, as you pointed out, trust has to be earned. If I want you to trust that I'm serious about change, I need to prove that I can handle honest feedback. Emma extended her hand across the desk. In that case, Your Royal Highness, I think we have a deal. As they shook hands, both of them realized that their confrontation had evolved into something neither of them had expected, a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. What had begun as a royal visit gone wrong was becoming the foundation for meaningful change in how authority figures engage with the people they're supposed to serve. There's one more thing, Emma said as they prepared to leave the office. What about my classmates? They witnessed something pretty unprecedented today, and they're probably confused about what it all means. Prince Alexander considered this. What do you think we should tell them? The truth, Emma said without hesitation. That you made a mistake, that I called you out on it, that you listened and learned from it, and they're going to work together to prevent similar mistakes in the future. Students rarely get to see authority figures admit they're wrong and actually change their behavior as a result. It might be the most valuable lesson they could learn from today's events. Then, that's exactly what we'll tell them, the prince agreed. After all, if we're going to advocate for authentic expression and honest communication, we should probably model it ourselves. As they walked back toward the classroom together, both of them knew that their unusual partnership was only the beginning. The real work of creating meaningful change would be much harder and would take much longer than a single conversation in a headmaster's office. But they had something to build on now: mutual respect, shared purpose, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important conversations begin with conflict and end with understanding. 3 months after the confrontation at Whitmore Secondary School, the story of Emma Chun and Prince Alexander had taken on a life of its own. What had begun as a moment of unexpected conflict had evolved into a national conversation about education, fairness, and the role of authority in modern society. The initial media coverage had been sensationalized, with headlines like "Student Challenges Royal Authority" and "Prince Put in His Place by Teenager." But as the full story emerged, including Emma's learning difference and the prince's willingness to admit his mistakes, the narrative became more complex and nuanced. Emma found herself at the center of a media storm she had never anticipated. Interview requests poured in from newspapers, television programs, and online publications. Advocacy groups for students with learning differences hailed her as a hero, while some traditionalists criticized her for disrespecting royal protocol. She handled the attention with the same thoughtful directness she had shown in her confrontation with the prince, always steering conversations back to the broader issues of fairness and understanding in education. Prince Alexander, meanwhile, had followed through on his promise to Emma in ways that surprised even his closest advisors. He had quietly established the Educational Fairness Initiative, a program designed to identify and address systemic inequities in how students are evaluated and treated. Emma served as the lead student advisor, working alongside teachers, education researchers, and disability rights advocates to develop new approaches to royal school visits and educational assessment. The first reformed royal visit took place at a comprehensive school in Manchester, and The difference was immediately apparent. Instead of viewing polished presentations in perfect classrooms, Prince Alexander spent time in resource rooms with students receiving extra support, visited with teachers about the real challenges they faced, and engaged in genuine conversations about learning differences, socioeconomic barriers, and the diverse ways students demonstrate their abilities. During that visit, the prince encountered Marcus, a 15-year-old with dyslexia who struggled with reading but had exceptional mathematical reasoning abilities. Instead of focusing on Marcus's difficulties with written work, the prince asked about his mathematical insights and was amazed by the boy's ability to solve complex problems mentally. The conversation was captured by a documentary crew that Emma had suggested should follow the reform visits, and the footage went viral online, sparking conversations about different types of intelligence and the limitations of traditional assessment methods. Back at Whitmore Secondary, Emma's confrontation with the prince had become legendary, but its effects were more practical than mythical. The school had implemented new policies for accommodating students with learning differences, and teachers had received training on recognizing and supporting diverse learning styles. Mrs. Morrison, Emma's English teacher, had become a vocal advocate for these changes and frequently spoke at educational conferences about the importance of looking beyond surface presentations to understand student effort and ability. Emma's classmates had been profoundly affected by witnessing her stand up to authority and seeing positive change result from that courage. Several students had begun speaking up more in class discussions, questioning assumptions, and advocating for themselves when they faced unfair treatment. The culture of the school had shifted in subtle but meaningful ways, with both students and teachers more willing to engage in honest conversations about problems and potential solutions. The academic world had also taken notice. Emma's original essay about authentic expression and conformity pressure had been published in an education journal, accompanied by a response from Prince Alexander reflecting on his own learning from their encounter. The exchange became required reading in several teacher training programs and was cited in research papers about student voice and educational equity. Perhaps most significantly, the Educational Fairness Initiative had begun to influence policy beyond royal visits. The insights gathered from students, teachers, and researchers were being used to develop new guidelines for educational assessment that took learning differences into account. Several universities had revised their admissions criteria to place less emphasis on standardized test scores and more weight on portfolios that demonstrated student growth and thinking processes. Emma herself had changed as well. The shy teenager who had once worried about speaking up in class had become a confident advocate, not just for herself, but for other students facing similar challenges. She had been invited to speak at conferences across the country, sharing her story and advocating for educational systems that valued substance over superficial presentation. Her relationship with Prince Alexander had evolved into genuine mutual respect. They met regularly to discuss the progress of the Educational Fairness Initiative, and their conversations had moved far beyond the issues that had brought them together. The prince had become genuinely interested in Emma's perspectives on social justice, youth engagement, and the responsibility of privileged individuals to use their positions for positive change. During one of their meetings, held in a quiet corner of the palace library, Emma had asked the prince if he ever regretted that day at Whitmore Secondary. Regret it? He had responded with surprise. It was one of the most valuable days of my life. You helped me understand that I wasn't really serving anyone with those meaningless visits. I was just going through motions that made me feel good about myself without actually helping anyone. But it must have been uncomfortable, Emma had pressed. Being challenged so publicly. Terribly uncomfortable, Prince Alexander had agreed. But discomfort isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's exactly what we need to grow and change. You taught me that uncomfortable conversations can lead to meaningful progress. Their partnership had become a model for other institutions seeking to bridge the gap between authority and the people they serve. Government agencies, corporations, and nonprofit organizations have begun implementing similar advisory structures, bringing in voices from the communities they aimed to serve to help guide their policies and practices. The story had also resonated internationally. Emma had received messages from students around the world who had been inspired by her courage to speak up against unfair treatment. Some had successfully advocated for changes in their own schools, while others had simply gained confidence to express themselves more authentically in their academic work. One particularly touching message came from a student in Japan with dysgraphia, similar to Emma's. She wrote about how seeing Emma's story had helped her explain to her teachers that her handwriting difficulties didn't reflect her effort or intelligence. The girl had included a photo of an essay she had written about the importance of understanding different learning styles, and while her handwriting was imperfect, her ideas were clear and powerful. As Emma prepared for university the following year, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that autumn day when Prince Alexander had criticized her handwriting. She had learned that standing up for what's right, even when it's frightening, can lead to changes that extend far beyond the immediate situation. She had discovered that authority figures, even royal ones, are human beings capable of growth and change when confronted with their mistakes in a thoughtful way. Most importantly, she had learned that her voice mattered, not despite her learning differences, but including them. Her perspective as someone who had faced unfair judgment had proven invaluable in helping others understand the harm caused by superficial assessments and the importance of looking deeper to understand individual circumstances and efforts. The Educational Fairness Initiative continued to expand, with plans to extend its reach internationally. Emma had been invited to help establish similar programs in other countries, sharing her insights about student voice and educational equity with educators and policymakers around the world. Prince Alexander, for his part, had become a changed person. His royal duties now felt more meaningful because they were grounded in genuine understanding of the people he was meant to serve. His visits to schools, hospitals, and community centers had become opportunities for real dialogue rather than performative displays, and the positive feedback from these institutions reflected the difference. The media attention surrounding their story had largely died down, but its impact continued to ripple outward. Teachers were more thoughtful about how they assessed student work. Administrators were more open to feedback from students about unfair practices, and students were more willing to advocate for themselves when they faced discrimination or misunderstanding. On the first anniversary of their confrontation, Emma and Prince Alexander returned to Whitmore Secondary together, not for a formal royal visit, but for a quiet reflection on how far they had all come. They sat in the same English classroom where their conflict had begun, surrounded by Mrs. Morrison's current students who were eager to hear about the changes that had resulted from that historic day. The most important thing I learned, Emma told the students, is that speaking up for fairness isn't disrespectful, it's essential. When we stay silent about injustice, we allow it to continue. When we find the courage to speak truth to power, we create the possibility for positive change. Prince Alexander nodded in agreement. And the most important thing I learned is that true authority comes from listening, understanding, and serving others, not from expecting unquestioned deference. Emma taught me that being challenged isn't a threat to legitimate authority. It's an opportunity to become more worthy of the trust people place in us. As they left the school that day, both of them knew that their unusual partnership would continue to evolve and grow. They had proven that conflict, when handled with honesty and mutual respect, could become the foundation for meaningful change. Their story had become more than just a tale of a student who stood up to a prince. It had become a testament to the power of authentic dialogue to transform both individuals and institutions. The legacy of that confrontational autumn day continued to inspire students, educators, and leaders around the world to value substance over superficial appearances, to listen more carefully to voices that are often dismissed, and to remember that the most important conversations often begin with someone having the courage to say, "That's not fair, and here's why."